The library was meant to be quiet, until she whispered, "Shh, keep quiet while I break the rules with you." The library had always been a sanctuary for him, a place where the hum of the outside world softened into a gentle backdrop of rustling pages and quiet footsteps. He pushed open the heavy wooden door, and a faint scent of old paper and polished oak greeted him. It was that comforting, slightly musky aroma that felt like a promise of calm, a pause from the rush of life outside. The afternoon sunlight poured through tall windows, dust motes dancing lazily in the golden shafts of light, making the air shimmer as if suspended in a dream. He moved slowly down the aisles, taking in the quiet rhythm of the library. Every so often, a soft footstep echoed off the high ceiling, blending with the gentle thump of his own shoes on the polished floor. And then he noticed her. She was arranging books on the shelves with a careful, deliberate grace, as though each volume deserved a kind of reverence. There was something magnetic in the way she moved, not hurried, not distracted, just present in the moment, completely absorbed in her task. She was in her early 40s, poised and elegant in a way that commanded quiet attention without demanding it. Her dark hair, loosely tied back, caught the sunlight and glimmered with hints of chestnut. Her eyes, focused and serene, seemed to scan the titles with a knowledge that went far beyond the catalogue, a depth that suggested she knew stories not just from books, but from life itself. He paused a few steps away, unsure why he was suddenly so aware of every subtle motion she made. A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips as if she sensed him watching, though she made no move to acknowledge it. His heart fluttered, a quiet, unfamiliar rhythm, and he found himself noticing things he never had before, the soft crease at the corner of her eyes when she concentrated, the gentle tilt of her head as she reached for a book, the way sunlight caressed the curve of her shoulder through the sleeve of her blouse. Every sense seemed sharper here. The faint creak of the old wooden floorboards, the soft thump of a book being closed, the barely audible whisper of pages turning, they all felt heightened, as if the library itself had conspired to slow time down. He wanted to step closer, but something restrained him, a subtle hesitation born from awe and uncertainty. There was an unspoken boundary here, one that felt both intimidating and inviting. And then their eyes met. For a brief, suspended second, she looked directly at him, and it was like a quiet acknowledgement, a gentle ripple in the still waters of the room. Her smile was subtle but knowing, the kind that hinted at secrets and stories untold. His pulse quickened. He turned the page of the book in his hands, pretending to be absorbed, but he could feel the warmth of that glance lingering longer than it should. As he wandered further between the shelves, he felt a strange mixture of calm and anticipation. Something about her presence called to him, an invisible thread that drew his gaze and his thoughts in ways he couldn't explain. He didn't know yet what it was about her, or why his chest felt both tight and strangely buoyant, but he knew one thing: this library, with its quiet corners and golden light, had just become a place of possibilities. And she, the librarian, was the one who had quietly, without a word, captured his attention. He had always loved wandering the aisles of the library, letting his fingers trace the spines of books as if each one held a secret meant just for him. That afternoon, however, his attention kept drifting back to her, the librarian who moved through the stacks with effortless grace, arranging books as though each page held a private significance. Her presence had a quiet weight, the kind that made him suddenly aware of every small sound he made, every step he took. He reached a shelf that towered above him, stacked with old, leather-bound volumes. Stretching to reach one of the higher books, he realized he couldn't quite grasp it. The precarious angle made him wobble slightly, and a soft sigh of frustration escaped his lips. Before he could adjust, a calm, steady voice spoke from just behind him. "Here, let me help you." He froze for a heartbeat, caught between embarrassment and the magnetic pull of her proximity. She stepped closer, the faint scent of her perfume, warm, floral, with a hint of something comforting and familiar, enveloping him. Her hand brushed against his as she reached for the book, and the brief contact sent an unexpected thrill through him. It was a light touch, yet it lingered in his senses longer than it should have, making his pulse rise and his stomach tighten with a quiet excitement he had not anticipated. As she handed him the book, their fingers lingered in a delicate brush. The warmth of her hand was grounding, a quiet reassurance, and yet it carried an undercurrent of something unspoken, something daringly intimate. He felt the gentle brush of her shoulder as she adjusted her posture, just close enough that the proximity made his breath hitch slightly. The library, usually a haven of stillness, now felt charged with a subtle electricity. He tried to focus on the book in his hands, flipping it open as though the words on the page could distract him from the awareness of her presence beside him. But her voice, soft and controlled, pulled him back again. "Careful with that one," she whispered, glancing down at the delicate pages. Her tone was light, almost teasing, and it stirred something deep within him, a mix of admiration, longing, and the quiet thrill of being noticed in a way that felt profoundly personal. For a moment, they stood in silence, shoulder to shoulder. The library's familiar noises, the soft shuffle of pages, the distant hum of a printer, the faint creak of floorboards, seemed magnified in the hush of their shared space. He could feel the subtle shift of her weight, the warmth radiating from her arm against his, the rhythmic rise and fall of her breath nearby. Each small sensation was heightened, charged with a tender intimacy that neither of them acknowledged aloud. Finally, he managed a small, awkward smile, and she returned it with a knowing tilt of her head. There was no need for words, the contact, brief and accidental though it seemed, had already said more than conversation could. In that quiet, golden-lit corner of the library, he realized something fundamental. Her presence could unsettle him and comfort him all at once, and the world beyond those shelves seemed to blur into irrelevance. As she stepped back gracefully, adjusting a strand of hair that had fallen over her shoulder, he couldn't help but linger on the memory of her touch. It was subtle, almost fleeting, yet it had left a mark deeper than any book could. He knew, even then, that this library, his quiet sanctuary, had become a place of anticipation, and she was the reason his heart now skipped in ways he had never expected. The library had settled into its familiar rhythm that afternoon, soft footsteps echoing off polished floors, pages turning like whispers, the occasional thump of a book being set down. He had moved to a quieter section, one lined with older, rare volumes that smelled faintly of parchment and cedar. He was so engrossed in examining a particularly intriguing spine that he didn't notice her approaching until she was just a step behind him. Her presence was immediate, grounding, and impossible to ignore. She leaned slightly over his shoulder, her hair falling in a loose wave that brushed the nape of his neck. The subtle warmth of her breath, scented with the faint hint of vanilla and old books, tickled the back of his ear. For a moment, he froze, caught in the tension of being so close to someone he both admired and felt inexplicably drawn to. "Shhh," she whispered, her voice low and velvety, a soft hum that seemed to vibrate in the quiet space around them. "Keep quiet." Her words were meant to caution, yet they carried an unmistakable lilt of playful defiance. It was the kind of whisper that made his heart stutter, that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end, and yet, it was intimate in a way that felt private, like a shared secret meant for no one else. He swallowed, suddenly hyper-aware of every movement, every tiny sound his body made, the slight scrape of his shoes against the floor, the rustle of his shirt as he shifted. She leaned closer, guiding his hand to a particularly fragile volume, her shoulder brushing against his lightly. The warmth of her touch was gentle but insistent, a subtle invitation that neither crossed a boundary nor left him uncertain. It was enough to send a shiver down his spine and leave his pulse fluttering. Her proximity transformed the air around him into something charged, electric with anticipation, yet soft and safe. He tried to focus on the book, on the delicate texture of the pages, the faded ink of the manuscript. But her presence kept pulling his attention away. He noticed the curve of her fingers as they held the book, the way her eyes lingered on his for just a fraction longer than necessary, and the faint, almost imperceptible smile that hinted at mischief. She was teasing, yes, but with a quiet intimacy that left him wanting more. "Be careful with this one," she whispered again, her lips barely brushing the shell of his ear. The closeness made him acutely aware of his own breath, of the tiny heat radiating from her body so near his. It was a forbidden thrill, the allure of doing something slightly against the rules, yet completely safe because it was shared between them alone. For a moment, time seemed to fold in on itself. The library's usual calm deepened, emphasizing the connection between them. He could feel the soft press of her shoulder, the light brush of her hair against his cheek, the subtle rhythm of her breathing. Every detail was magnified, charged with a silent, unspoken desire, a yearning that neither of them had yet fully acknowledged. Finally, she straightened, stepping back just enough to restore a semblance of distance, yet leaving a lingering warmth that he could feel in his chest long after she moved away. That brief shared rebellion, the whispered words, the fleeting touch, the stolen closeness, had marked the beginning of something undeniably magnetic. In that hushed, sunlit corner, he realized the library had transformed, from a quiet sanctuary into a place where rules could be bent, and hearts could be quietly, dangerously, drawn together. The quiet corner of the library had become their refuge. Shelves towered around them, creating a cocoon of books and sunlight, where the outside world felt distant and unimportant. He found himself drawn to that space more than ever, not just for the rare manuscripts or hidden nooks, but because she was there, calm, poised, and quietly compelling. He sat across from her at a small wooden table, the late afternoon light filtering through the high windows and catching in her hair, highlighting chestnut streaks that seemed to glow. She had a stack of books in front of her, but for once, she wasn't arranging them or cataloging. Instead, she leaned back slightly, watching him with a softness in her gaze that made his chest tighten. "I never really liked being alone," he confessed, almost without thinking, tracing the rim of his coffee cup as if it could steady his nerves. His voice was quiet, meant only for her, yet the vulnerability in it made him feel exposed in a way that was both frightening and exhilarating. She tilted her head, studying him with a gentle attentiveness. "Loneliness isn't always about being alone," she said softly, her voice a melody that seemed to wrap around him. "Sometimes it's about not being seen, even when people are around." Her words resonated deeply. He had always considered himself observant, but with her, he felt both observed and understood. It was unsettling and comforting all at once. He noticed how her hands rested lightly on the table, fingers brushing the edges of her books. The gesture was unassuming, yet the calm strength in it was magnetic. I just like the quiet," he admitted, eyes drifting to the dust motes dancing in the golden sunlight. "It's easier to think there, away from everyone else." She smiled faintly, a soft, knowing curl of her lips that didn't need words. "I understand," she said. "Sometimes the world outside feels too loud, too demanding. Here, with books, with someone who listens, it's different. Safe." Their knees brushed under the table, a subtle, accidental contact that sent a gentle warmth through him. He realized he hadn't noticed before just how aware he was of her presence, the slight pressure, the warmth radiating from her body, the steady rhythm of her breathing. He wanted to linger in that moment, to let the silence stretch and deepen their connection. Encouraged by her openness, he spoke more, sharing small, honest confessions, the anxieties he rarely admitted, the insecurities he tucked away behind a careful exterior. She listened without interruption, her eyes attentive, her expression soft but focused. And when she spoke, it wasn't to judge or advise, but to share, to reveal a vulnerability of her own. She told him of her quiet loneliness despite her confidence, the way she sometimes felt the weight of time pressing against her, and how the library had been her refuge for years. Her hand moved slowly, almost instinctively, to rest lightly on his as he gestured. The warmth of her palm against his was grounding, intimate, and reassuring, a physical echo of the emotional honesty they were sharing. It was a moment charged with trust, with subtle longing, with the kind of quiet intimacy that made his chest feel both full and fragile. As the sunlight waned, casting long, gentle shadows across the table, he realized that something had shifted. The library was no longer just a sanctuary of books, it was a space of connection, a hidden corner of vulnerability and trust, where hearts could speak quietly and honestly without fear. And with her, he felt a stirring of something deeper, a slow, intoxicating pull toward her that neither of them needed to name aloud just yet. The library had grown into something more than just a sanctuary for him. It had become a stage for small, fleeting moments that made his chest tighten with anticipation. That afternoon, he found himself wandering into the same quiet section where the librarian often lingered, drawn as much by the lure of her presence as by the books themselves. The golden light slanted through the tall windows, catching in her hair, making it shimmer like spun copper, and he felt an almost physical pull toward her. She was perched on a small step stool, reaching for a book on a high shelf. When she glanced down and caught him watching, her eyes sparkled with an unreadable expression, a blend of mischief, curiosity, and subtle challenge. He tried to look away, focusing on the rows of books, but he felt her gaze lingering on him in a way that made his pulse hitch. "Your taste in books is unusual," she said, her voice low, playful, carrying a teasing note that sent warmth through him. She moved closer, stepping down from the stool, and their shoulders brushed lightly. The touch was accidental, yet charged with something unspoken, an electric friction that lingered far longer than the brief contact warranted. He felt acutely aware of her presence, the warmth radiating from her arm, the faint fragrance that clung to her, the gentle rustle of her blouse as she shifted. Every small movement seemed amplified in the quiet library, the soft click of her shoes, the way her fingers grazed a shelf as she passed, the subtle tilt of her head when she looked at him. Each detail made his chest swell with a quiet, nervous excitement, a mixture of admiration and something deeper he didn't yet fully understand. She leaned down to retrieve a book from the lower shelf, and he caught a glimpse of the soft curve of her neck, the way sunlight caught the highlights in her hair. When she straightened, her hand brushed his arm lightly, a fleeting contact, but it lingered in his senses, leaving a warmth that made him shift closer without realizing it. The teasing tone of her voice, the sparkle in her eyes, and the subtle intimacy of her gestures created a tension that was both thrilling and forbidden. He tried to focus on his own task, but her presence demanded attention. She handed him a book, and their fingers brushed again, intentional or not, he couldn't tell. The warmth of her touch, the softness of her palm, and the subtle proximity made him aware of his own heartbeat, of the fluttering sensation in his stomach, and of the unspoken desire that hung in the space between them. "You always seem so serious," she murmured, leaning in slightly, her voice carrying that quiet lilt of challenge. He could feel the faint brush of her shoulder against his as she moved closer, the closeness both thrilling and terrifying. For a moment, the library seemed to disappear around him. The quiet, golden light, the faint scent of books, the gentle brush of her presence, it all coalesced into a charged, intimate moment. He realized he was no longer simply a visitor to this place of knowledge, he was a participant in a subtle dance of glances, touches, and unspoken emotions. The teasing lingered, the flirtation intensifying in small, almost imperceptible ways. Every brush of her fingers, every lingering look, every playful word created a slow, intoxicating tension. And in that quiet, golden-lit corner, he understood that the thrill of the forbidden, of doing something slightly outside the rules, together, was pulling them inexorably closer, heart and soul, even before any words of confession could be spoken. The library had always been a place of rules, a sanctuary of silence and order, but that afternoon it felt like a secret universe where time could bend and hearts could speak without words. She appeared in the quiet corner he had begun to favor, a knowing smile playing at the edge of her lips. There was a glimmer of mischief in her eyes, the kind that made him forget everything he thought he knew about boundaries and propriety. "Come with me," she whispered, her voice soft but infused with urgency. She led him toward a narrow corridor tucked behind rows of tall shelves, a part of the library rarely used, and certainly off-limits. The air here was cooler, tinged with the scent of old paper, varnished wood, and faint traces of her perfume. The narrow space made every movement feel more intimate, every sound amplified, the faint rustle of her skirt, the soft click of her shoes, the quickened pace of his own heartbeat. He hesitated for a moment, aware of the forbidden thrill. But her eyes held a warmth that invited trust, and something about her presence made the hesitation melt away. She was not only leading him into a physical space but guiding him into a moment that was emotionally charged, a shared secret that neither could fully articulate. Once inside the secluded nook, she motioned for him to sit on a worn wooden bench, its surface smooth from years of use. She stood close, almost brushing against him, her warmth enveloping him in a way that was startling yet comforting. The sunlight filtering through the tiny window illuminated her face, highlighting the soft curve of her cheek, the delicate arch of her brow, and the intensity in her eyes as she watched him. "This section is technically off-limits," she murmured, leaning in just slightly, her shoulder touching his. "But I wanted to share it with you." The brush of her arm against his sent a jolt through him, subtle but undeniable, a mingling of excitement and hesitation. He noticed the way her fingers lingered on the spine of a book as she handed it to him, the softness of her hand, the unspoken care in the gesture. Their shoulders and knees brushed lightly as they arranged the volumes together, a contact that felt both innocent and charged with unspoken desire. Every subtle touch, a finger grazing his wrist, a lean toward him to examine a title, felt magnified in the secluded silence, creating an intimacy that words could never capture. They talked quietly, voices low, sharing thoughts and laughter that felt like a private language. The thrill of breaking the rules together, of sharing a space meant to be off-limits, intensified the connection between them. He could feel the warmth of her breath, the subtle sway of her body as she leaned closer, the tiny brush of her hair against his cheek. Each sensation was amplified by the quiet secrecy of the moment, each gesture steeped in tenderness and anticipation. When she finally straightened, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face, their eyes met across the small space. There was a long, suspended moment where the outside world vanished entirely. The library's rules, the expectations, the distance of age and experience, none of it mattered here. All that existed was the quiet understanding, the shared heartbeat of two souls daring to connect in a world that often demanded restraint. In that secluded nook, amidst the scent of old books and the filtered sunlight, something had shifted irrevocably. They were no longer just librarian and visitor, they were two people who had discovered a fragile, intoxicating closeness, a slow-burning intimacy that promised something deeper, something unspoken, yet undeniable. The library, once simply a quiet sanctuary, had transformed into a place of connection, trust, and unspoken understanding. Days passed, and he found himself returning more often, not just for the books but for the moments they shared, fleeting glances, gentle touches, and whispered conversations that seemed to exist in a world all their own. Each visit was an unfolding of familiarity, yet always tinged with the thrill of something delicate and rare. That afternoon, sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long, golden streaks across the polished floor and warming the worn wooden tables. He spotted her arranging a stack of books near the restricted section, the soft motion of her hands precise and graceful. When she looked up and saw him, her face softened into a quiet smile, one that held a mixture of warmth, reassurance, and something tenderly playful. He walked toward her, each step echoing lightly in the vast space, and she gestured to a small, sunlit corner where they often shared whispered confidences. The air was filled with the comforting scent of old books and the faint trace of her perfume, a delicate, familiar fragrance that had become almost like a second layer of her presence. Sitting across from her at the table, he felt a profound sense of ease, as though every nervous flutter of his chest in the earlier days had settled into a steady rhythm. She reached out first, placing her hand lightly over his as he reached for a book. The touch was gentle, reassuring, yet intimate in a way that conveyed trust and care. He could feel the warmth of her skin through the thin fabric of his sleeve, the subtle pulse of life beneath her fingers, and the grounding steadiness it brought. "Did you enjoy that section we explored last time?" she asked softly, her voice calm, carrying that quiet intimacy that had always drawn him in. He nodded, unable to hide the small smile that tugged at his lips, and she returned it with a gentle warmth that made the corners of her eyes crinkle slightly. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of unspoken words, shared understanding, and the deep satisfaction of closeness. Their conversation drifted to favorite passages, characters that had lingered in their minds, and small, personal reflections, nothing dramatic, nothing overtly romantic, yet every word, every glance, every subtle brush of fingers across the table was layered with meaning. Each moment reinforced a bond that was quiet but profound, a connection born of mutual respect, emotional honesty, and tender attention. When he finally looked up, their eyes met across the table, and the world outside the library seemed to vanish. There was no rush, no urgency, only the warmth of mutual understanding. He could see in her gaze the same mixture of admiration and quiet desire that he felt, tempered by patience and emotional depth. In that instant, it wasn't the thrill of rule-breaking or whispered secrets that mattered, it was the steady, comforting presence of each other. As she gave a soft, approving nod, their hands lingered together briefly, intertwined in a gentle, YouTube-safe embrace of affection. It was a simple, everyday gesture, yet it carried the weight of everything they had shared: curiosity, excitement, vulnerability, and trust. The library had become more than a place of books, it was a space of quiet love, slow-burn connection, and emotional sanctuary. He left that day with a full heart, carrying the warmth of her touch, the light of her gaze, and the steady assurance that their story, tender, slow, and profound, had found its safe, enduring place. Did you feel the quiet spark between them? If you loved this slow-burn romance, hit like, subscribe, and click the bell icon so you don't miss the next story where emotions, secrets, and hearts collide. Share your thoughts in the comments. Who else loves a story where every glance and touch tells more than words ever could?